for coming. My laptop died yesterday morning. I want to thank Marion Reed for letting me use hers. If this had happened a year ago, it would have been a disaster, but thanks to the miracle of Dropbox, my slides were safe. One member of the audience was in awe when I said, I'm completely backed up. You've never heard of that happening. The system crashed before. There'll be a little bit of disorganization because I wasn't able to pull everything together that I had still developing, but I think I'll have something to show you.
Where's the collection cam for your laptop?
If you like this talk, you know how you could express your appreciation. Okay, my starting point is nothing that will be news to this crowd. I've been doing digital humanities since before we called it digital humanities. We used to call it humanities computing, and it was very heavily rooted in text, and in text that we marked up in SGML, the predecessor of XML. And the text, of course, is our data. It's where we look for information, but my starting point, which, as I said, will not be used to this crowd, is that the data is not the information. Rather, the data gives us access to information, and I'll talk about that distinction in a minute, and ultimately we wind up with, if we are lucky, some knowledge. One of my starting points in advocating visualization, and I don't feel particularly like a pioneer here, lots of people are doing this, I just want to roll together some examples from my own work, some of which I haven't seen before. But my starting point is that the textual data, of which there is much, can obscure the information, and the information is what we care about. Graphic visualization, on the other hand, can get that text out of the way and expose the information that we care about. I'm going to illustrate this quickly on the basis of 5 projects in which I've been involved, and each of them used a graphic visualization at some point, and I will talk 3 minutes apiece about what they did. Some of them are more interesting than others, but what they have in common is they step away from the letter of the text and try to show you something about the structure that would be difficult to see if the words were getting in the way. As I said, I've been in this business for a long time, so I remember when digital humanities consisted of taking something that used to print on paper and putting it on the screen and feeling very pleased with yourself. And that I don't want to poo-poo that entirely. It facilitated the distribution of texts, it facilitated their preservation, it facilitated their accessibility, by which I mean not just that you could get on a web browser and see them, but you could poke them through a screen reader. They were accessible in ways that they weren't before, so it really was a step forward over non-glassy paper. If we move to where most of the industry is today, we are exploiting the properties of digital texts that transcend what's available in paper. You don't just have the back of the book indices that the editor made up for you. You have structured searching, you have plain text searching, you have dynamic pages. In many of our projects, the page that our users go to doesn't exist until the user configures it by entering parameters. We have nonlinear access, and at this point it is no longer the paper edition on the screen. It is views that the editor couldn't possibly give you on paper without filling up your bookshelves. The way I like to think of this is that we view our documents not as prose, but as databases, and they have information, and part of the organization of that information is linear. And if we want to get a reading view, we can indeed replicate what we would have on paper, but that's not primary, and in many cases it's not what we're most interested in. My primary field of study is medieval manuscripts, and I look at medieval manuscript descriptions where we talk about the features of the writing and the codicological features of the physical book and the linguistic features of the language in which the text is instantiated. And at the 2005 DH conference in Paris, I suggested that once we have this approach to documents as databases, we could approach the study of similarity among manuscripts from a quantitative perspective, and we could begin to look at, for example, are there correlations among these features that a human normally wouldn't notice? Is there a similarity between, say, the way a certain the way a certain letter is represented on the page, which is a traditional part of paleographic description, and the number of lines on the page. Now, there's no logical reason why there should be. I'm not suggesting there's any causal relationship, except if you find correlations where you don't expect them, and if they turn out to be significant, it may tell you that there's some connection among these manuscripts, and that then tells you something about the history of the transmission of this cultural heritage material. So once your documents are more than just words, once they become repositories of information of a particular type, you can begin to do things with them other than just read them. I think we can go beyond that at this point. We just saw that in the preceding presentation. We can begin to look at graphic visualizations of our data and get a little further away from the words. So to sum up this perspective, I want to say that the text itself isn't information. Text is one view of the information, and in many cases it's not the most useful view. In some cases, of course, it is. The first project I want to talk about is some work that I've been doing with a colleague, Sybil and Forrester at Swarthmore College, on a mid-19th century Russian salon novel by Karolina Pavlova called A Double Life. In A Double Life, Cecilia, the protagonist, is the most present character in the novel. She's all over every chapter, but as one might imagine in a mid-19th century salon novel, she frets and she wonders whether she should marry the sort of rich older man who will take care of her, or the younger man who she kind of sort of loves, and it's not, well, in any case. One of the things Sybil is a Russian literature specialist, and her interest in this was to examine the relationship between Cecilia's presence and her agency. And in particular, is she all over the novel because she's actually an important person, or does she just kind of sit on the sidelines while people talk about her and plan her life for her? Well, does she speak, or does she act, or is she just there as a focal point for others? Also of interest would be how her role changes over the course of the novel. If she's present throughout, but if her agency changes, is that correlated with something else that's going on in the novel? More generally, one can look not only at Cecilia in relationship to everybody else, but for example, Sybil was interested in what the roles of men and women were in this novel. After all, the novel is on a certain level about relationships between men and women, and Cecilia is representative of her sex and representative of other issues. Now, I have, and this is where I suffer for being on somebody else's laptop. Give me a second to find this. I have a we started with a plain text. We marked it up in XML, and to begin with, we marked all mentions of characters. And this is easy when they're mentioned by name. It's a little harder in Russian than in English because the endings change, but we were able to do some auto-tagging. We then went in and tagged all the pronouns. So every time a character appears in any capacity, we've recorded it. And once we've done that, we can do things like automatically build a chart that represents their occurrences. So here we have our chart, and we have a list of the characters up on the top. This is a sort of proof of concept interface, so it's not as it's not what you normally show an end user. You might say, well, gee, you have no data. What's going on here? Along the x-axis, we number the 10 chapters, and we indicate what percentage of the novel they represent. Up on the y-axis, we have a scale indicating just mentions presence of the character, whether the character is a speaker or talked about, or any time there's any noun or pronoun that refers to the character, there it is. You will notice that this scale is not linear, it is quadratic, because I don't care whether there's a difference between 120 and 121. That's kind of not important. I care a great deal whether there's a difference between 0 and 1. So I toyed with the scale, and this came up with a representation. So I can, if I want to see where Cecilia goes, I select her name, and up she goes, and I can mouse over the little pieces, and it shows me where she is. So I can recall the real numbers if I need them. If I want to compare Cecilia to, for example, all of the other women in the novel, I could select all women. Let's make them blue. Now, Cecilia is a woman, so I have to change her back to red here. And this is something I can clean up in the interface later. But what we can see is Cecilia dominates all of the other female characters in every chapter except chapter 7. And in chapter 7, there's a lot going on. There are other people involved. We don't know who they are. This representation doesn't do analysis for you. It just tells you what to look at. And one can look at men versus women and things like this. Now, this is SVG. It's an XML vocabulary, and what I like about it is I got it for free once I had marked up the document to create a reading view, and there's a reading view, and it's converted into HTML, and it looks like the novel looks. But once I had done that, I write a one-screen XSLT script, and out pops this, and I'm able to animate the SVG using JavaScript. And now what we have at this point, and let me go back to my slide set. We start by marking up the character references. We generate the line graph in SVG, and we do that programmatically. We enable dynamic interaction so that the user can look around and compare specific things. What we haven't done yet is mark up the speech and speakers. So we know who's present where. We still don't know whether they're actively present or passively present, so that's sort of where we're going next. We want to chart that relationship, and you can imagine there could be other graphic representations of that. One of the interesting things about this project, and it's something I can do in Russian and it's difficult to do in other languages, is when we start counting speeches, how do we do it? Do we count the number of times they speak? Well, that doesn't fairly distinguish a long speech from a short speech. We can count the number of characters, that's easy. But if we're talking about speech, maybe it would be more interesting to measure the duration of the speech phonetically rather than orthographically. And in Russian, happily, every vowel letter is a syllable. There's no place where you have two vowel letters together that represent one syllable. So every vowel letter is a syllable, and no non-vowel letter is a syllable. I can count the syllables, which means in kind of a rough way, because there are differences in syllable length, but in kind of a rough way, I can measure the duration of speech on the basis of a written text in terms of oral speech. And one of the things we'd like to look at is whether there are differences there. Now, all of that becomes salient once I get the words out of the way, and I have a chart that represents these occurrences. I can count them any way I want, but it's a whole lot easier to see than it would have been in the old days when I would have had to look at the page and measure the lengths of the paragraphs. I did a medieval manuscript project called the Repertorium of Old Bulgarian letters and language. And what I was looking at was mixed content miscellany manuscripts. These are like free-form encyclopedias. So a miscellany manuscript might have a saint's life, followed by a sermon, followed by a pseudo-scientific treatise. And these are all different. And the primary form of creativity in the Balkan Middle Ages was to create new miscellanies. Much more common than creating completely new texts. You created new compilations. And I wanted to look at how these compilations were similar and different. In some cases, we know that a scribe took a whole book and copied the whole book and has the same text in the same order. But in most cases, that doesn't happen. In most cases, they would pick and choose, but they would pick and choose in clumps. So the scribe would pull a book off the shelf, pick his favorite text, copy it, get to the end, and we infer, say, oh, this next one looks pretty interesting too, and he would keep copying. These miscellanies, therefore, can be similar in their selection and the arrangement of their contents. And I didn't just want to measure which miscellanies had the same texts. Because I have that model of copying in mind, it was more important if they had the same text in the same order than if they didn't. And that would tell me, I thought, something about the textual transmission, which miscellanies had partial shared ancestors. I had to think about how to visualize that relationship. In the old days, it was done with tables. This is a very traditional method of study in Slavic philology. This type of study of miscellaneous manuscripts goes back to the middle of the 19th century. And traditionally, it was done with lists and tables. And I saw people in the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences put down a great big sheet of paper and draw a table on it. And I'll show you what one of those looks like in a minute, abstractly. The new way is going to be with graphic representation. So the table would look something like this. There are the manuscripts on the top. There are the texts on the bottom. So it's the life of St. Curly and a sermon by St. Larry and things like this. And in each manuscript, they would write the numbers showing the position of that text in the manuscript. Not all texts are in all manuscripts. But one of the things you can see here, for example, is that in manuscript 1, the leftmost column, you have 4, 5, 6, and 7. In manuscript 3, you also have 4, 5, 6, and 7, but they're in a different position. What this tells me is that the scribes of those manuscripts are likely, at a certain level, to have used a common source. Whether they're dependent on each other or mutually dependent on something else is a philological question. This sort of analysis doesn't give you the answer, it just tells you what to look at. What I do nowadays is I mark up the contents of the manuscript in XML, and then I write XSLT and throw it into a statistical analysis package. I used R, which was the object of one of the workshops at the beginning of boot camp. And I said, I told it how to do the comparison. And there are traditional measures of similarity which do not apply in this case. For example, in traditional measures of similarity, everything is perfectly similar to itself. Similarity varies between 0 and 1, etc. Now, what was important to me is if I have two manuscripts that contain only two texts and they're the same texts, that's 100% similarity. But that could have arisen by chance much more easily than if I have two manuscripts that consist of 100 texts and they're all the same ones in the same order. So what my ad hoc definition of similarity is not what a mathematician would call similarity, but it's a better measure of what I wanted to do. That meant I had to do the measurements myself. The statistical software doesn't know how to do this because it's not a traditional statistical method. I do the calculations, I throw the number into the system, and it comes out and gives me this representation, and it tells me that these guys form a cluster where these are quite similar to each other, and so are these, and the lower down you are, the greater the measure of similarity according to that system. What's helpful here is we've been studying these manuscripts for a long time, including before there were computers. We have an idea of which ones are similar to which other ones. It looks like this. So, and if you have a half a dozen manuscripts, it's kind of easy. There are 103 in this, and we have 350 in our corpus at the moment. So what this is going to tell the busy philologist is, don't bother comparing this one to that one. Don't even look at them together. You're probably not going to find anything. The other representation that, where did I do this? I have to load this into the browser. The other, talk amongst yourselves. Once I've identified the manuscripts I want to look at, I want to see exactly how they're similar. This is a plectogram. Each of these columns represents a manuscript. These are the texts in the manuscript in order. If two manuscripts have the same text, there's a line connecting them. What we can see at a glance is that these three guys are really similar, even to the point that they have the same text multiple times. Between these two, there's a sequence here that seems to have something going on, except there's an insertion there, and there are a few other places, but otherwise they're pretty different. A lot of the texts in here occur there, some in order and some not. And this tells us, and based on the patterns we discover, we can draw conclusions about what the relationship is. So we had one instance where we had two manuscripts, all of the texts were in common, but the top half here corresponded to the bottom there, and vice versa. This is rebinding. The book comes apart, they pick up the two halves, they put them in the wrong order, and that's something that emerges very easily from this, and it's a little harder to get to if you're looking at the titles. The picture gets the words out of the way and it shows you what's going on. Now this is a static slide, but in real life, these are all live links. You click on this and you get a list of all of the manuscripts that contain this particular text. You click on this and you get information about the manuscript. So this isn't just a report. This is a stage in exploration, and it's a graphic stage. It's a way that you can move from the graphic abstraction back to the text, and from the text to the graphic abstraction. We start by marking up the manuscript contents. We can produce a traditional prose manuscript description from this, but we're treating it as a database for these purposes. We can generate the Dendrogram, which clusters the manuscripts according to our calculation of similarity. We can generate the plectogram, and these diagrams are for free. I don't draw them. I write a little XSLT script, and the user says, I want to look at these three manuscripts, and the system says, okay, here's your picture. Both of these enable dynamic generation. Both of them give that workstation interface, and that's, I mean, we all know what a workstation is, but what I mean by the term is that every time you get one of these pictures, it's anticipated where you want to go next. Never do you get a report. Just a report. If you need to hit the back button, we blew it. This is supposed to be a stage in exploration. You're supposed to be able to walk around your corpus with this. The Zatochnikon is a study of the writings attributed to Daniel Zatochnik, a medieval Russian pundit, I guess you would call him. The text is a florilegium. It's a collection of wise sayings. Understood. It's a collection of wise sayings. There are two versions of the collection called the Slov and the Malenia. They are not considered versions of the same text. They are considered different works that have a lot of shared textual material. The textology is quite complicated. There's certainly some mutual interdependence, but we don't know which way it goes. And there are traditional ways to explore how these are related. The old way was with tables. The new way, on the other hand, is with this kind of representation. So here's the Slova, here's the Manania. You click on a piece of one of the sayings in the Manania, or you click on one of the sayings in the Slova, it highlights it. It selects the corresponding ones in the Manania. So I've clicked on 2, it selects 2 and 5, and it shows you the biblical passages that are cited here, but the cool part, the graphic visualization, is up here. This is a different sort of plectogram. So there's the 2 I clicked on, it maps to 2 and 5, and in this prototype, this stuff isn't animated yet, but in the next stage, you click up here and these move, and you click down here and these highlight, so you have a graphic entry point into the texts, along with a textual entry point. Mark them up, which we had to do anyway, generate the plectogram, transform the text, in other words, into a map, and make it dynamic, interactive. So at the moment, the 2 sides are interactive. The next step is to bring the top piece in, integrate the plectogram. I have like 3 minutes left, so I've got to cut short the very end, but there is one more I want to show you because this is kind of my favorite. I'm looking at calendars of saints at the ends of Gospel and Apostle manuscripts, and the calendar of saints has a date and it tells you which saints are commemorated. The Orthodox Church did not have a central canonization authority. There was nothing comparable to Rome, and what it meant was you could be a saint in one village but not in the next village. And what that means is these calendars of saints vary in the saints that they record. And if 2 manuscripts have the same saint, it tells you that perhaps there's some shared textual transmission going on there. We can conceptualize this as a social network, and here's how we do it. Imagine that manuscripts and saints are Facebook users, right? Manuscripts can friend a saint by including them on a particular date. Manuscripts cannot friend other friends, but imagine Ariane and I we're not friends. We're not friends on Facebook. But each of us is friends with all of you. Well, there's a very strong indirect connection between us, even though we don't know it. So if we're manuscripts and you're saints, congratulations, well, we've inferred an indirect network relationship. And that's what I'm trying to do here. We mark up the monology, we extract the values, we feed it to a network analysis program, we generated a network map, and here's what it looked like. Everything is clear, right? The graphic visualization has gotten the text out of the way, and now you can see that everything is related to everything else. How do we get rid of this? Well, the problem is that most saints are in most monologies. Most saints are, the beheading of John the Baptist the monologies contain not just saints but events. The beheading of John the Baptist on whatever date it was is everywhere. The map is overwhelmed by the popular saints. So we conceive the notion of a loser saint. This is a saint who doesn't have any friends. Loser saints have only 2 friends, and therefore we've gotten rid of data and we've held on to information. We don't care about the shared entries, we care about the shared rare entries. And once we do that, once we get rid of those extra lines that are poorly differentiated, that don't actually give us what we want, well, we come up with a different representation. So here I've thrown away the popular saints, I have only the loser ones, the spaghetti is gone, and one can see very easily, the way to read this is the thickness of the line shows you the strength of the relationship. The distance tells you something too, but that's because there are a lot of things pulling on the nodes. The distance is less telling than the thickness. Now, why this is a particularly good idea is social network tools are really good because there's a lot of money to be made from them. Nobody's writing really good tools for us because we're not a rich industry. But what this means is if we can conceptualize the study of medieval manuscripts in terms that other people use to make money, we can use their tools. And I couldn't have written mapping software like that. I'm going to show you one last picture, and then I'm going to shut up. This is a project that was done by one of my students. She had never seen, before the beginning of the summer, she had never seen an angle bracket. She was looking at patterns of speech in Russian fairy tales, and she wanted to see whether there were verbs that were used more often, verbs of speech used more often by men than women. And on the basis of marked up texts, she comes up with a list of verbs, And she orders them according to whether they are prominent in male speech or female speech. And you can see as I scroll down the bar chart here that this is a very handy way to look at the distribution of the verbs. At the moment, this is kind of our first report, so we don't have it set up yet to tickle the threshold. You might, for example, want to eliminate the verbs that occur only twice. There are a lot of those, and maybe they're not particularly predictive. So I have a wrap-up slide here, which I will now jump to. By way of saying, we've looked at 5 projects that employ visualization, getting rid of the text in each case, and in doing that, expose some of the information that might have been obscured just by the textual information. And I finished with 1 minute to spare. Does anybody have a really sharp question?
Wondering about the collections example, presence and sequence of material, and I'm wondering whether you thought about edit distance as a measure of similarity.
I did, and I rejected it because it would have been nice. I would have liked to be able to depend on tools that were already there. One of the problems with edit distance is it deals with insertions, deletions, transpositions, and the like in ways that might make sense in, say, modeling DNA, where mutations may be independent of each other. But if I'm assuming a model where the scribe is working with chunks of text, then I have to think about edit distance in terms of not just the individual items, but also the chunks. And at that point, it becomes complicated. And the model I came up with required that, my starting point was that if I have, say, 6 texts in sequence in 2 manuscripts, and they can be in different places. The exact position doesn't matter, because I don't care when the monk pulled the manuscript off the shelf. I just think that these 2 monks pulled the same manuscript off the shelf. But if I have 6 texts in order, my thesis is, or my hypothesis is that that's more weighted, that should be weighted more heavily than if I have 2 places with 3 texts in common, because it's less likely to have arisen by chance. And when you think about it, it's, for example, if all I were measuring were whether they had the same 6 texts in common, that doesn't necessarily tell me they came from the same source. The same 6 texts in common in order tells me more. So I needed to weight the long sequences more heavily than the sum of short sequences with the same number of units. And it didn't matter to me exactly how I did that. I just had to make the weights grow at a greater than arithmetic rate. So I came up with the one that I knew how to program. And what this means is that the absolute values don't matter, but the relative values do. A higher value, to me, says that based on philological expectations, I believe that there's more likely to be shared textual transmission rather than accidental coincidence than if there was a lower numerical value. But whether the difference is 100 or 200 or 500 units doesn't matter as much. And that's obviously something that could be refined. I'm not quite sure how.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.